What happens when Hollywood's most beloved pirate meets late-night television's most ruthless interrogator? You won't believe what unfolds when Johnny Depp sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance, only to have the host turn the conversation into a personal attack that would leave audiences stunned and one of cinema's biggest stars walking off the stage in disgust. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in the most explosive late-night television moment of the year. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started like any other, with the familiar theme music and Kimmel's trademark smirk as he welcomed viewers to what he promised would be a very special show. The audience was buzzing with anticipation as they waited for the evening's main guest, Johnny Depp, who was scheduled to appear to discuss his upcoming film projects and his recent return to the spotlight after years of legal battles and personal struggles. As the cameras rolled and Kimmel delivered his opening monologue, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The host's usual jovial demeanor seemed forced, his jokes landing with uncomfortable thuds, as he made several pointed references to celebrities who think they're above the law and actors who confuse their on-screen personas with reality. The audience laughed nervously, sensing something was brewing beneath the surface. When Depp finally made his entrance, the contrast between the two men was immediately apparent. The actor walked onto the stage with his characteristic swagger, dressed in his signature style of layered jewelry and vintage clothing, flashing his famous smile to the cheering crowd. But as he settled into the guest chair, his body language suggested he was already on guard, perhaps having heard whispers about what Kimmel had planned for their encounter. "Johnny Depp, everybody," Kimmel announced with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks for being here, Johnny. How are you feeling these days?" "I'm doing well, Jimmy. Thanks for having me," Depp replied, his voice carrying that familiar rasp that had charmed audiences for decades. "Always good to be back in Los Angeles." The first few minutes proceeded normally enough, with Kimmel asking about Depp's latest projects and his experiences working with various directors. But eagle-eyed viewers could see the host's fingers drumming impatiently on his desk, his eyes never quite meeting Depp's as he delivered his questions with mechanical precision. "So, Johnny, you've been through quite a lot in recent years," Kimmel said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. "The legal battles, the public scrutiny, the tabloid headlines. How do you handle all that negativity?" Depp's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his composure. "You know, Jimmy, I've learned that the truth has a way of coming out eventually. I focus on my work, my family, and the people who truly know me. The rest is just noise." "Just noise?" Kimmel pressed, leaning forward in his chair. "Some pretty serious allegations were made against you. Are you saying all of that was just noise?" The audience fell silent, sensing the shift in the conversation's tone. Depp's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "I'm saying that I've addressed those matters through the proper legal channels, and I'm moving forward with my life and career. But don't you think the public deserves to know the real Johnny Depp?" Kimmel continued, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge. "Not the character you play in movies, but the man behind the makeup and costumes? I think the public knows me through my work." Depp responded, his fingers now gripping the armrests of his chair. "I've been making films for over 3 decades, and I've always tried to bring authenticity to every role I play." Kimmel laughed, but it was a cold sound that seemed to echo through the studio. "Authenticity? Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been playing the same character for years. The misunderstood rebel, the tortured artist, the victim of circumstance." The camera zoomed in on Depp's face, capturing the flash of anger that crossed his features before he regained control. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Jimmy." "What I'm getting at," Kimmel said, his voice rising slightly, "is that maybe it's time to drop the act. Maybe it's time to stop hiding behind your quirky persona and address the elephant in the room." "And what elephant would that be?" Depp asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The tension in the studio was palpable now, with audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something unprecedented was about to unfold. "The elephant," Kimmel said, pausing for dramatic effect, is that you've built an entire career on playing the misunderstood outsider. But maybe the real question is whether you're actually the problem. Depp's eyes flashed with barely contained fury, his knuckles white as he gripped the chair arms. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Kimmel said, his mask of civility finally slipping away completely. "How many sets have you been late to? How many co-stars have complained about your behavior? How many assistants have quit because they couldn't deal with your demands?" The audience gasped audibly, some members looking around nervously as if they weren't sure whether this was part of the show or a genuine confrontation spiraling out of control. "Jimmy," Depp said, his voice carrying a warning tone, "I think you're crossing a line here." "Am I?" Kimmel shot back. "Or am I just asking the questions that everyone else is too polite to ask? You've been coasting on your reputation for years, showing up to film sets unprepared, making everyone else's job harder while you indulge in your little fantasy world." The color drained from Depp's face, and for a moment, the studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of accumulated frustration and anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about." But Kimmel wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, clearly enjoying the reaction he was getting. "Oh, but I think I do. I think you've been living in your own little world for so long that you've forgotten how to interact with real people. You've surrounded yourself with yes-men and enablers who tell you what you want to hear, and now you can't handle it when someone calls you out." The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, and everyone in the studio could feel it. What had started as a seemingly innocent interview was transforming into something far more sinister, with Kimmel's calculated cruelty pushing one of Hollywood's most famous actors toward what appeared to be an inevitable breaking point. Depp's hands began to tremble slightly. Whether from rage or the effort of maintaining control, it was impossible to tell. His voice, when it came, was measured but deadly. "Jimmy, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've worked with some of the most respected directors, actors, and crew members in Hollywood. If you have something specific to say, then say it. Otherwise, I suggest we move on to discussing why I'm actually here." But Kimmel had clearly prepared for this moment, and he wasn't about to let his prey escape so easily. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder, placing it deliberately on the desk between them. "Funny you should mention your 30 years in the business, Johnny. Because I've done some research." The camera caught Depp's eyes narrowing as he stared at the folder, his jaw clenching visibly. "What kind of research?" "The kind that reveals patterns," Kimmel said, opening the folder with theatrical flourish. "Did you know that in your last 5 films, you've been reported as being anywhere from 2 to 4 hours late to set on a regular basis? Or that 3 different directors have publicly stated they would never work with you again?" "That's not true," Depp said, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. "Isn't it?" Kimmel pulled out what appeared to be printed articles. "Because I have statements here from people who worked on your recent projects. Anonymous sources, of course, because apparently people are afraid to speak out against the great Johnny Depp." The audience was now completely silent, many covering their mouths in shock at the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a public execution. "You want to know what one of your co-stars said?" Kimmel continued, reading from the papers. "They said working with you was like babysitting a spoiled child who thinks the world revolves around them. Another crew member described you as completely unprofessional and disrespectful to everyone around. You." Depp's face had gone from pale to flushed, his breathing becoming more rapid. "Those are lies. Complete fabrications." "Are they?" Kimmel's voice was now dripping with mock concern. "Because there's a pretty consistent pattern here. Sets shut down because of your behavior. Millions of dollars wasted because you couldn't be bothered to show up on time or learn your lines." "Stop," Depp said, his voice barely controlled. "And then there's the drinking," Kimmel continued relentlessly. "Multiple sources confirming that you've shown up to work intoxicated. Is that the authenticity you were talking about earlier?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Depp's hands were now visibly shaking, and the veins in his neck were standing out prominently. The man who had captivated audiences as Captain Jack Sparrow was being systematically dismantled on national television. "You don't know anything about me," Depp said, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge that made several audience members shift nervously in their seats. "Oh, but I do," Kimmel replied, clearly enjoying every moment of his victim's discomfort. "I know that you've been living in a fantasy world for so long that you've forgotten how to function in reality. I know that you've surrounded yourself with people who are too afraid or too well paid to tell you the truth." "And what truth is that?" Depp asked, his voice now barely above a whisper. Kimmel leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "That you're not the misunderstood artist you pretend to be. You're not the tortured genius or the romantic rebel. You're just a middle-aged man who never learned how to grow up." The words hit Depp like physical blows, and the camera captured every micro-expression of pain and rage that crossed his face. His breathing was now rapid and shallow, and his hands had formed fists in his lap. "That's enough," Depp said, starting to rise from his chair. "Sit down, Johnny," Kimmel commanded, his voice suddenly sharp and authoritative. "We're not done here." For a moment, it seemed like Depp might actually comply, but then something shifted in his expression. The hurt and confusion were replaced by something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating anger that seemed to emanate from deep within. "You think you know me?" Depp said, slowly settling back into his chair, but his posture was now that of a predator preparing to strike. "You think you can sit behind that desk and judge me based on some anonymous quotes and tabloid gossip? I think I can recognize a fraud when I see one," Kimmel shot back, but there was a slight tremor in his voice now, as if he was beginning to realize he might have pushed too far. "A fraud?" Depp laughed, but it was a sound devoid of any humor. "Let me tell you about fraud, Jimmy. Fraud is sitting in that chair every night, pretending to be America's funny uncle while you're actually just a bully with a platform. Fraud is building your career on making fun of people who can't fight back." The tables were beginning to turn, and Kimmel's confident smirk was starting to fade. "I'm just doing my job, Johnny." "Your job?" Depp's voice was gaining strength now, fueled by years of pent-up frustration. "Your job is to entertain people, not to ambush guests with character assassination. But I guess that's what passes for entertainment these days, isn't it? Tearing people down for ratings." "You're deflecting," Kimmel said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Am I?" Depp leaned forward, his eyes boring into Kimmel's. "Or am I finally seeing you for what you really are? A small man who gets his kicks from humiliating others because it makes him feel important." The studio was electric with tension now, the audience caught between fascination and horror at what they were witnessing. This had gone far beyond a simple interview gone wrong. It was becoming a battle for the soul of late-night television itself. "You want to talk about patterns, Jimmy?" Depp continued, his voice now steady and controlled. "Let's talk about your pattern. How many guests have you humiliated over the years? How many careers have you tried to damage with your little gotcha moments?" Kimmel's face was now flushed, and he was gripping his cards so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "I ask tough questions. That's what journalists do." "Journalists?" Depp laughed again, and this time there was genuine amusement in his voice. "Is that what you call yourself? A journalist? You're not a journalist, Jimmy. You're a parasite who feeds on other people's pain." The confrontation had reached a critical mass, with both men now fully engaged in verbal combat. But even as the tension continued to build, it was clear that something even more explosive was about to happen. Kimmel's face was now completely red, his composure cracking under Depp's relentless counterattack. "You're out of line, Johnny. This is my show, and I'll ask whatever questions I want." "Your show?" Depp stood up slowly, his full height towering over the seated host. "This isn't a show, Jimmy. This is a hit job. You invited me here under false pretenses, and now you're trying to destroy my reputation on national television." The audience was completely transfixed, many recording on their phones despite the studio's strict no-recording policy. The security guards stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this unprecedented confrontation play out. "I'm asking legitimate questions about your behavior," Kimmel insisted, but his voice was now defensive rather than aggressive. Legitimate? Depp's voice rose to a roar that echoed through the studio. You call ambushing a guest with anonymous accusations legitimate? You call character assassination journalism? You're nothing but a coward hiding behind a desk. Kimmel shot up from his chair, his face contorted with rage. Don't you dare call me a coward. I'm the one with the courage to ask the hard questions. Hard questions? Depp laughed bitterly. You want to know what a hard question is, Jimmy? Here's one. How do you sleep at night knowing that your entire career is built on humiliating people for entertainment? The two men were now standing face to face, separated only by the desk between them. The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating, and several audience members had begun to leave, unable to handle the intensity of what they were witnessing. At least I show up to work on time, Kimmel spat. At least I don't disappoint everyone who depends on me. That was the final straw. Depp's eyes blazed with fury as he stepped around the desk, moving closer to Kimmel. You want to know about disappointment? You want to know about letting people down? Look in the mirror, Jimmy. Look at what you've become. What I've become? Kimmel's voice cracked slightly. I'm successful. I'm respected. I have a show that millions of people watch. You're a bully, Depp said, his voice now deadly calm. You're a small, pathetic man who gets his kicks from tearing others down because you can't build anything of value yourself. You hide behind your writers and your audience, but deep down, you know you're nothing. The words hit Kimmel like a physical blow, and for a moment, he seemed to deflate, but then his anger returned with renewed force. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, Depp replied. I know that you've turned what should be a celebration of creativity and talent into a gladiator arena where you sacrifice guests for ratings. I know that you've forgotten what it means to be a human being. The camera operators continued filming, capturing every moment of this historic meltdown. The director in the control room was frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let this play out, ultimately choosing to keep rolling as they witnessed television history in the making. You're delusional, Kimmel said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're living in a fantasy world where you're the victim and everyone else is the villain. Maybe I am living in a fantasy world, Depp admitted, his voice suddenly softer but no less intense. But at least my fantasies don't involve destroying people's lives for sport. At least I try to create something beautiful instead of tearing down what others have built. The change in Depp's tone seemed to catch Kimmel off guard. The host's anger began to waver, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy? Depp continued, his voice now carrying a note of genuine sadness. You actually have talent. You could have been something special. But instead, you chose to become this monster, who feeds on other people's pain. I'm not a monster, Kimmel whispered, his earlier bravado completely gone. Then prove it, Depp challenged. Apologize. Not to me, but to every guest you've humiliated. To every person whose career you've tried to damage. To every family who's had to watch their loved one get torn apart on national television. The studio was completely silent now, the audience hanging on every word. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how this would end. For a long moment, Kimmel said nothing, his face cycling through various emotions, anger, shame, defiance, and finally, something that might have been recognition. But then his expression hardened again, and he straightened his shoulders. I don't owe you anything, he said, his voice flat and cold. This is my show, and I'll run it however I want. Depp stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head sadly. You're right, Jimmy. You don't owe me anything, but you owe yourself better than this. You owe your audience better than this. And someday, when you're alone with your thoughts, you'll realize that what you've become isn't success, it's failure of the worst kind. With that, Depp turned and began walking toward the exit. But Kimmel, perhaps realizing that he was losing control of the situation entirely, made one final desperate attempt to regain the upper hand. Running away, Johnny? He called out. Just like you always do when things get tough? Depp stopped, his back still to the host, and for a moment it seemed like he might turn around. The audience waited with bated breath, wondering if this confrontation would escalate even further. Instead, Depp spoke without turning around, his voice carrying clearly through the studio's sound system. "No, Jimmy, I'm not running away. I'm choosing not to waste any more time on someone who's forgotten what it means to be human. Good luck with your show. I hope it was worth your soul." And with that, Johnny Depp walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience and a host who looked like he'd just been hit by a freight train. The cameras continued rolling as Kimmel stood alone behind his desk, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. The studio erupted in confused murmurs as audience members tried to process what they had just witnessed. Some were applauding Depp's dramatic exit, while others seemed shocked by the entire confrontation. The show's staff scrambled to figure out how to handle the situation, but it was clear that something irreversible had just occurred. As the studio lights dimmed and the cameras finally stopped rolling, Jimmy Kimmel remained standing behind his desk, staring at the empty chair where his guest had been sitting just moments before. The confrontation was over, but the consequences of what had just transpired would reverberate through Hollywood and beyond for weeks to come. In the end, what had started as a simple promotional interview had become something much more significant, a moment when the mask of civility that usually governs celebrity interactions was completely stripped away, revealing the raw humanity underneath. And while both men would eventually move on with their careers, neither would ever forget the night when late-night television crossed a line that could never be uncrossed.